The courtroom was filled with a silence that resembled the atmosphere before a storm. The distant ticking of the clock and the sound of guards' footsteps on the marble floors created a sense of anticipation that hung in the air like a deadly hailstorm. The elderly man, James Smith, a war veteran, sat in the defendant's chair. His back was straight, but his eyes revealed a fatigue that couldn't be hidden. His hand, which held the easel stick, the only relic left to him after the brutal battles, trembled, yet he kept his gaze fixed on the judge. Judge Harrison, a man of middle age with harsh features, called the case to order. He had a reputation for being stern and unsympathetic toward those who appeared before him. Today, he was particularly resolute. This case seemed important to him for establishing justice. Smith, you are accused of fraud and manipulation of state funds related to your participation in veterans programs, the judge shouted across the courtroom, disregarding how the old man sat in the dock. Jason Smith, known for his modesty and pleasant character, now seemed completely shattered. The judge didn't like him. Many said it was because James had once broken some rules in military units, though he had never meant to break the law. And now, after losing all his veteran benefits, he seemed to have become a victim of the judicial system. Your Honor, I have not committed any crime. I am a loyal citizen of this country, who served in a war to defend it. My only goal is to survive. I ask you to consider my case objectively. James proclaimed, his voice firm, though his heart pulsed with pain. The judge merely shrugged and raised his documents. There is no time for mercy, he said curtly, and it seemed his words cut through the atmosphere of the room. But suddenly, the courtroom doors opened. A man appeared in the doorway, whose dark eyes drew everyone's gaze. It was Donald Trump. His stride was confident, and his face serious, though his expression was not angry, but rather intrigued. Trump was neither a lawyer nor a witness in the case. He simply entered the room as an outsider, but that was enough to completely change the atmosphere. All eyes were on him as he passed by and sat in the front row. Judge Harrison fell silent, unexpectedly clenching his teeth. He knew who this was, and what this man could do to change the course of the case. What are you doing here, Donald Trump? The judge asked, barely holding back his irritation. You know, Harrison, I don't think it's your decision who to judge and who not to, Trump replied calmly, his voice low and firm. I've heard about this case, and I think James Smith doesn't deserve to be here. If you are a corrupt judge, then your time has passed. The courtroom fell silent for a moment. The spectators present could hardly believe what they were hearing. Trump, who had never been known for his tolerance of corruption, merely looked at the old judge with cold confidence, ready to change the situation. The judge involuntarily stepped back as if he had been struck. He couldn't afford to appear weak in front of the man. This is none of your business. Harrison finally shouted, though he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice. This is my business when it comes to justice. And I promise you, this will be a serious case, Trump firmly replied. This was only the first part of the story, but already, the tension in the air had become almost unbearable. Everyone present in the courtroom knew, this wasn't just a trial. This was the beginning of something big. Trump had no intention of simply watching. The courtroom was packed. The faint rustling of papers, indistinct voices of lawyers, and the quiet sound of footsteps created an atmosphere of tense anticipation. Jeremy Thompson, a military veteran who had fought for his reputation and honor after decades of service, sat in the defendant's chair. His hands, firmly clasped on his knees, seemed unable to settle. Every glance, every word from the judge relentlessly pierced him, like thorns. The corrupt judge, William Barker, leaned toward the microphone, preparing his verdict. The judge's gaze was cold and merciless. He wasn't interested in justice, only in satisfying someone's interests, getting his cut from the sensational case. This trial session was just another step in selling the truth for money, which he would later use to pay his benefactors. Your Honor, this man deserves everything that's coming to him, the prosecutor said, his voice sounding confident, although everyone in the courtroom knew it was a lie. Thompson stood there, tall and calm, not allowing his emotions to throw him off balance. The war had taken much, friends, health, but not his strength of spirit. He knew that if he gave in now, he'd lose everything he had left. The immense pressure squeezing him couldn't defeat his inner calm. Suddenly, a man quietly opened the door and entered the courtroom. He wasn't on the list, he wasn't announced, but he entered with such confidence that all eyes immediately turned to him. Donald Trump, the former president, an influential and controversial figure. He was such an unexpected guest in this case that it took a moment for everyone to realize how his presence would change the course of events. Trump didn't rush to sit among the spectators. Instead, he headed toward the table where Thompson's lawyer sat and, turning to the judge, said, "Your Honor, this case is not just a matter of law. It's a matter of humanity, of justice. And I can assure you that in my presence, this man has lost more than you will ever be able to imagine. If you don't release him, if you don't restore his honor, I have no further business with you." Trump's tone was so decisive that the murmuring in the courtroom ceased. Judge Barker turned his gaze to him, initially with disbelief, and then with noticeable irritation. He had gotten used to working in the shadows and avoiding public scandals, but this situation made him uneasy. Donald Trump, regardless of his political reputation, had enough influence. "What are you doing here?" Barker asked softly, trying to maintain his posture as the stern judge, though he had no arguments to back it up. Trump didn't falter, his words clear, without emotion. "I'm here to ensure that this case isn't exploited for the benefit of a few interested parties. You have a chance to change the course of this case. Don't waste it." Everyone in the courtroom felt how the situation shifted. This was no longer just a trial. It had become a matter of morality, a question of who had the right to decide the fate of a veteran who had given his best years to the country. Barker felt Trump's gaze on him, but he lacked the courage to oppose him, even in his own courtroom. Thompson stood calmly, not taking his eyes off Trump. In his eyes, one could read gratitude, but even more, hope that even in this situation, there was a chance for justice. The judge raised his hand, trying to regain control over the situation, but the moment when the courtroom fell into complete silence was irrevocably lost. "I will decide what happens next," Barker finally said, trying to restore his authority. But his words no longer carried the weight he had expected. Today, he felt his control slipping through his fingers. Thompson took a step forward, speaking for the first time since the beginning of the trial. "I'm ready to discuss this, Your Honor. I want us to sort this out justly." It became clear to the judge, prosecutor, and spectators, this was not just a trial. It was a battle for justice and morality that could not be treated as a mere political game. The stage was set for the climax, but the remaining question was, would each of them have the courage to take the right step? The courtroom was once again filled with the pressure of an impending storm. All eyes were on Thompson, who seemed to have taken a step back from his decision to fight. He wasn't ready to give up, even after his reputation and honor were threatened. Trump stood beside his lawyer, maintaining his silence, but his presence undoubtedly altered the course of events. He was not just a politician. He was a symbol of power and influence, ready to use all his resources to prove his point. Barker nervously tapped his fingers under the table, as he often did when his attention was distracted. He couldn't afford another public scandal. It was crucial to keep everything under control. But this moment, this unstable balance between justice and corruption, was pushing him toward a decisive move. "Your Honor," the prosecutor's voice broke through for the first time in a long while. He was clearly nervous, trying to keep the situation within his calculations. "This case must proceed according to the law. Personal beliefs or political pressure cannot influence the verdict." "Of course," Trump responded without pausing. "But in this case, Your Honor, the law itself is not always a guarantee of justice. In our country, a lot can be done by looking at what a person deserves, not just what is written in the books." Barker shot a sharp look at Trump, but he did not look away, clearly showing who had the power in the room now. Thompson turned to his lawyer, whose face showed deep concern. He knew this case wasn't following the standard procedure. It was more than just a trial, it was a political game. And now, he had a choice, to continue the fight for justice or to give in to the pressure hanging over him. "Your Honor," Thompson finally raised his voice again. "I've given decades of service to this country. I've left much behind not to be what they're trying to make me here and now. If this is my last chance, I want it to be for truth, not for money, not for politics, but for what is real." The tone of his voice grew stronger, and each word was piercingly clear. The judge, still stunned by how easily the situation had gotten out of hand, realized he could no longer delay his decision. He looked at Thompson and saw not just Amun, but the entire history, the loss and pain it entailed. Barker raised his gavel, struck it against the table, trying to collect his thoughts, but failed. He knew that the verdict he was about to announce would change everything. And this wasn't just a case, it was a battle for justice, to show who truly had the power in this country. "We must make a choice," he said, pausing the gavel in midair. "This will not just be a verdict. It will be a signal that justice still exists, or it will be lost forever." A silent moment before the final word. Everyone in the room held their breath. What would the judge decide? "I declare a recess," Barker finally said, unable to withstand the pressure any longer. He leaned back in his chair and tried to think. But everyone already knew, after this recess, the trial would never be the same. There would be no more simple decisions. The break in the court session lasted longer than anyone could have predicted. Judge Barker left the room, trying to calm himself, but his eyes showed that he was on the edge. Outside the courtroom, the situation was escalating. Thompson's lawyer, stood by the door, taking deep breaths, thinking about the defense strategy. "We have to act while there's still time," he whispered. Thompson stood, his facial expression hard to read. Was it anger or calmness? But inside, he felt only one thing, the unbearable pressure pressing on his heart. He knew that the decision being made right now would change his life forever, and not just his. Barker returned after 10 minutes, his face heavy. He sat down at his desk, but everyone noticed how his hand trembled slightly when he picked up the gavel. The room fell silent. Everyone understood that the verdict would be announced, and each person waited to see whose hands would hold the final word in this case. Barker took a deep breath and looked at Thompson, who didn't take his eyes off him. The silence in the room was broken only by the sound of the gavel when the judge finally spoke. "This court has made a decision." Thompson could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know if this would be the final blow or a chance for redemption. It seemed like the moment was stretching on forever, and every word the judge said became crucial. Barker lifted his head and glanced at Trump's lawyer, then at the prosecutor. "This court cannot simply ignore political pressure. It should not influence our decision. We, as servants of justice, must choose between what is right and what is convenient. And therefore—" Everyone held their breath, and a shadow of realization crossed Trump's face, as if he knew things were not going according to plan. "I rule that Thompson is entitled to a retrial," the judge announced. "We will send this case back for appeal. It cannot remain under the influence of politics or personal interests." The rest of the room erupted in whispers. However, for Thompson, this was salvation, though only temporary. The case being sent back meant another chance for justice, but with significant risks for his career and life. But this was not the end. As soon as the judge declared the recess, everyone understood that the real battle was just beginning. Now, it would take more than just a verdict. This was a political war, and Thompson was just a pawn in this game. But he was ready to fight until the end. And when the break was over, he would stand at the center of the storm, and no one would be able to bring him to his knees. A few minutes after the judge announced the decision to recount the case, the courtroom filled with noise. People sitting in the gallery began exchanging glances, some whispered to each other, while others silently pondered what they had heard. It seemed like this moment had become significant, but Thompson felt it was only the first part of the battle, not its final victory. Barker left the room with his assistants, and the court officers quickly began closing the doors. Trump's lawyer approached him, expressing displeasure in his words, but Donald remained calm, even cold. He wasn't in a hurry to leave the room because he knew that in this game, everything was still ahead. He turned to Tom. "This isn't the end, Tom. This recount is just to buy time. You need to be ready for the next phase. Now we know who really has the power here. And it's not the judge. It's those standing behind him. Thompson understood, all these maneuvers, all these strategic steps, were part of a much larger plan. They had to weather the political storm that was inevitably approaching. The next day, they met in a private office, where Trump said, "I know what they want from us, Tom. But we will act differently. If we want justice, we need to act, not wait. We need to be brave and stand up for our rights, even if it costs us more than we can afford." This isn't just Thompson's case, it's the case of everyone who wants to change this system. Thompson agreed. He knew this conflict wouldn't be resolved quickly, but now he had a new goal, to change the situation, and not just for himself. As for Judge Barker, his reputation had already started to unravel. Dozens of people in the court's corridors were whispering about how politics and personal interests had influenced his decisions. Justice was postponed, but that didn't mean it was lost. Only one question remained: who would win this battle, and could Thompson find his way in the light of these changes? But while the answer remained uncertain, a small victory was already on his side. Now he knew that even in the most hopeless situations, there was a chance for change. And this was just the beginning. Trump left the office, leaving behind the door that quietly closed. He returned to his affairs, while Thompson stood by the window, gazing at the misty perspective ahead of him. The feeling of struggle didn't let go, but in his heart, hope had appeared. And that small step was the first in a great change that could affect not only his life but the whole country.